Friends, welcome to another episode of GHC Insights. And with me today, I have Yvette McDonald. Yvette, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself for this episode?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me. It's a real delight to be here. I'm the owner of Elixir Consulting, which does strategic HR consulting for organisations, and the founder of the Christian Leadership Framework.
Just as a brief plug, tell me about that framework.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a framework that I designed, particularly when working with Christian organisations. I've got 20 years of background working in the space of helping to develop leaders, but found that many of the tools that I was using from my corporate experience weren't landing for Christian organisations. And so developed a framework that could be applied to any context, whether it's a school, a church, a not-for-profit, but really trying to synthesize biblical principles and best thinking in leadership and management.
Fantastic. I think we'll put a link in the show notes. But for this episode, I want to come back to a conversation we had, I think, about 2 years ago, where you introduced me to the idea of the 4 disciplines of execution. And actually, that's been quite formative in the construction of growing healthier churches, in helping churches to think about their health, how to focus and how to execute. But to give us kind of the 30-second, maybe 60-second overview of what this concept is.
Yeah, so I think we feel the need to have leaders that are both faithful and fruitful. And why I think the 4 disciplines of execution was pretty interesting is that it helps any organisation think about how and what to measure. And so it's some work that was pulled together to think about the kind of things that you want to measure. And typically we make the mistake of measuring outputs rather than inputs. And typically we measure too many things. And so it was a way of being able to help people work out what are the 1 or 2 things that you're really, really striving for, and to create a language of accountability around that, and to create a sense of what's the ultimate good, or what does success look like?
Yeah, great. Some of those words we might be allergic to at times, success, maybe even accountability. We'll have to come back to that. But one of the things that I really resonated with in the 4DX kind of framework is the starting premise that the whirlwind is very real. And as a pastor, the whirlwind of ministry, that weekly cycle, there's always 1,000 balls in the air. It feels wild. And so to actually step back and say, okay, they use the language of wildly important goals. Is that right? The WIGs? Yep.
Yeah.
What are we going to try and focus on particularly? Otherwise, the whirlwind will just take over.
100%. I think the hardest thing about pastoral ministry is that you are constantly feeling the pull to react to today's issue or today's crisis, and it really can pull you into responding in the moment rather than kind of lifting your eyes to think about where are you heading, what is the longer term vision that you're trying to align people around. And the whirlwind is real. It's not just true in churches, it's equally true in corporates as well.
Yep. So just remind me, I think I can remember the kind of the steps they outline in the 4DX, or the 4 disciplines. There's 4 of them. That's in the title. The first one is the wildly important goals. So what you're going to focus on. The second one is
to act on your lead measures. So one of the key mistakes that organisations often make is that they're measuring results rather than thinking about how do you measure the lead into that, and what's the input that you're measuring. And this is particularly true in Christian organisations. If we're thinking that the number of people that God converts is a measure that we're responsible for, we really are, we've got that wrong. But what we're responsible for is sharing the gospel. So a better measure might be around how many times are we sharing the gospel rather than how many people are we converting. So that's the second measure.
Yeah. And so if we might be prompted to just simply ask, are we a church that invites? Because if we're not inviting at all, and we shouldn't just wonder why nothing's happening.
Absolutely. And it's not our work to convert hearts. It's our role is to be willing and ready to share the hope that we have.
Yeah, and just some technical language stuff here. Lead actions. That's probably not something that we're all familiar with.
Yeah.
How would you describe that?
So, in kind of thinking about corporate and leadership language, there are lead measures and lag measures. A lead measure is something that you do to create an outcome, which is a lag measure. So, a lag measure in the corporate space might be measuring. Selling widgets. And so the number of widgets that you sell is a lag outcome. However, the thing that leads to you selling X number of widgets is the number of cold calls that you make to your clients. And that's the lead measure. So you're measuring the input that will create the output. Similar in Christian context or a church context, if your lag measure might be the number of people that you're raising up as leaders and the number of people you have to run your youth group or your Bible study groups. The lead measure that you might be interested in measuring is the number of people that you're currently discipling to become leaders, to lead that next generation of ministry.
I wonder actually if an example might come straight from this. So if we look at kind of our 5 health gauges, I mean, one of the helpful things I found is that lag measures, they lag, they take time to shift. And so if you want to say, well, let's focus on improving our stay ratio, that is the number of people who come through the doors of our church as visitors and then stay to become church members. If we want to improve that, we can't do something tomorrow and just lift that. We're going to have to do a bunch of lead actions, which then we can measure as lead measures. And hopefully we see that result in the lag measure, increasing. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, it's not up to us whether someone stays at a church, but what we can control and have influence over is the number of things that we invite somebody to, or the welcome that we give someone, how connected how welcoming an environment that we create.
Again, that's really helpful, because I think sometimes the danger in using metrics like this is what it might say to our hearts as leaders. That is, you're in control of everything. I think I see this as a tool to catalyze some thinking about what's happening and what could happen. But yeah, that's great that the lag measures here are under God, and we're doing what we can to be faithful and fruitful there. That's helpful. Yep.
So the task then for the leader is to then think about, how do we create the system that creates that input? So I think one of the challenges often in pastoral ministry is that a lot of the work that we do happens through relationships, and we don't necessarily think about what's the pathway for someone to stay. So what are the things that we need to be doing to help someone to stay and to create a process
that's
out
great.
of that, so it's not just reacting.
As we think about kind of the strategic dashboard behind this, again, that helps us think about what kind of process exists at the moment, and where are we seeing kind of blockages, or where are we seeing we drop balls or people missed, and then how do we improve some of the ministry actions we might do, and then let's see if that actually lifts that lag measure.
Absolutely. So the third discipline is creating that compelling scoreboard, which you've showed there. And that fourth discipline is creating the cadence of accountability. So having a regular staff meeting, whether it's once a week, once a fortnight, to say, okay, what percentage of our newcomers did we follow up this week? What percentage of our Bible study leaders have we discipled or coached this week? So having that regular rhythm of doing the boring conversation to check in on how are we going with the things that we know will make our ministry effective.
Yeah, great. Again, let's come back to accountability later, but the scorecard's actually a significant step in the 4DX thinking, because it brings people together. And so it's not just a leader, putting a PowerPoint slide on to say, here's where we are, this is what we need to do. It's about creating that platform for us to see things together. Do you want to expand upon that?
Yeah, sure. Well, what's lovely about a scorecard is that there's complete transparency. There's no surprises. And if you're able to have a scorecard, then you can put your ego aside and go, well, this is the facts of where things are at. And so we can be look at things in a way that's really quite objective, instead of having all of the other stuff in there as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as I think about even conflict resolution, they say that that's best done when you're not just throwing the ball to each other and, but you're actually looking at the ball in between. There's this,
Mm.
some objectivity. And so actually being able to have that scorecard on the table and everyone talking about either their interpretation of it or kind of what they're noticing, that's really significant as a team moment.
Mm. And what's nice is that if you then partner up with other people, you can then say, how do you, like, what you can benchmark with others or you can learn from others, because if you've got a similar scorecard, then there's a way of being able to have a conversation that's broader than just your context. Because one of the things that happens, particularly for organizations or churches that are growing and kicking goals and doing great stuff, it's really easy to become complacent. But if you've got other people with a similar or the same scorecard, you can go, hey, how can we learn from each other, so that we can gain the best information from each other, so that we can continue to improve and not kind of rest on our laurels too much.
Yeah, that's great. And we're hoping that you can use the user group for GHC users to kind of share, what they're noticing. And that's a vulnerable step to share kind of your scorecard a little bit. But this comes back to something you said a little while ago about, defining what is good. So, if your scorecard comes up, and if we just maybe came back to, if we came back to this sort of, scorecard that overviews the whole dashboard, as we look at those dials, I mean, it automatically prompts the question of, or are we happy with that? Could we imagine better? What does good look like? And that's actually, we shouldn't skip over that, because that's actually, that's a foundational part of the conversation about what you might do next.
100%. And I think that's, to your point, why you need to have user groups or people outside of your own context to then look in and go, actually, a stay ratio of X is, you could probably do more than that. And so this is where you need to kind of rest on the experience of others and insights from others sometimes outside your own context, to help questioning and challenging you to think about what good could be.
Yeah. And in this, I like the idea of creating some distance too, and not letting our egos get too bruised by this. I mean, for instance, in this particular example of this church, regularity is quite down. You normally be like, oh, I'm really crushed by that. But right now we could say, well, COVID and the lockdown we're having in Sydney has really affected our ability to even do good data recording. And so they're starting to frame it up. But then we need to come back to that and say, actually, we're back in church in a month's time. Has it started increasing because we've got better data? And if it stays at 37%, then we need to ask some bigger questions.
And I think it's always interesting when we look at data and go, oh, there are these external factors going on. This is why this is happening. And then if we start looking at those external factors, it might be worth asking, are we looking at a lag measure or a lead measure? So I used to work in the beverage industry for a soft drink company. And always results would be great when it was a hot day, because people would always have that second can of soda, soft drink, or drink more water or whatever it was. Or if it was a particularly cold summer, we'd have lots of excuses around why sales weren't great. And so I think we just need to interrogate when numbers aren't what we expect them to be, and we start looking at external forces. We then need to go back to our lead measures and go, well, what was our process? What would regularity look like in a COVID context?
Yep.
And to kind of rethink, do we need to kind of tweak our process, or are we just relying on external factors to make up excuses?
Yeah, good one. So just to kind of come back to overviewing the 4DX, it's about creating that focus. What are you going to focus on to try and lift? Because you can't lift everything at once. There's just, we're only mortals. Secondly, it's about creating those lead measures. So what are you going to do to try and lift that area of focus? So for instance, in the example we gave, trying to improve the stay ratio, what are the 3 or 4 things you might be looking at that you're trying to do week in, week out, that you think will eventually lift that stay ratio? And then the scorecard, so coming back together as a team to actually look over what's happening in lead and lag measures, and then finally creating that rhythm of accountability, which we'll come back to in a second episode. Is that right? Have I got it right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that fourth piece around accountability is probably the trickiest piece in all of the steps, particularly in church contexts where there hasn't traditionally been that rhythm of accountability.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for helping us think through this. Again, look at the show notes if you want to know more about what Yvette gets up to. And if you want to grow in your leadership, she might be able to help you do that. But thanks for helping us think through how to use 4DX as a concept to help us as ministry leaders use tools like GHC. Thanks very much.
My pleasure, and God bless.